Ladies and gentlemen, the situation we are facing is grave. What was once a space of freedom where plebs could access infinite amount of boobies is now turned into an Orwellian nightmare, affecting our freedoms to do whatever we want on the internet. And as part of the 100th episode of The Public Space, we are talking to Frame Games about restoring the state of liberty on the internet. How are you doing, Frame Games?
I'm doing good. Very serious indeed. This is the issue of our time for those of us who spend so much on the internet, but really for all mankind. Because what I want to try to convey tonight is how we really stand at the precipice on regulation of speech all over the world, in the U.S., in Europe, in China, and I hope tonight to present a case to those afflicted with libertarianism. Um, I once had that. I once had the syndrome, the disorders, the set of symptoms associated with believing that all and only the free market is capable of affecting change, and that when you are a dove, you can just eat the hawks if they're the bad guys. I used to root for the nerds in the movies and all that good stuff. And I still think that's good on principle. But there comes a time where you need to puff up your chest and get just a weensy bit authoritarian about your boundaries. And that's really what tonight is about.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm a libertarian, but not in a kind of dogmatic fashion. And as far as making laws, I'm not against making laws. I'm not against a sort of state, a monarchic state, enforcing some sort of law, to the extent that these laws are not managerial. As a libertarian, I oppose to the state acquiring more and more power and more size in the economy. But if the states, if the people decide that part of their freedom is protected by a law, part of their right to consent, or part of their freedom of speech, for example, I don't oppose to a law coming and setting the stage. I'm very emotional against. I have an emotional and primitive reaction to complicated laws and to laws that essentially shape economic systems. But a law that would say there are certain basics there are certain basic human rights that relate to the internet that you cannot infringe upon. I'm relatively warm to the idea.
Yeah, well, and it also depends on how broadly you define the term state. So part of what motivates my worldview, and the one that I hope more libertarians come to adopt, is that the narrow definition of state to be, basically wholly public entities like the Department of Justice or the Department of Agriculture or something like that, is a very narrow conception of what the state is. And it may have made sense in the 1800s and early 1900s before the modern sprawl of public-private partnerships has occurred. And in the current landscape, you really need to ask yourself, if, for example, a government agency has 92% of its federal contracts to private companies of a very particular political persuasion, and those companies, in return, promote the government agendas of one political party and systemically discriminate through disparate impact against right-wing or centrist voices, do you really consider that quote-unquote private enterprise to be private? At what point do they become public, or at least part of what we consider the governance of public entities?
Absolutely. That's the big problem of even small laws. Even a law that says, for example, you need not to shit on the ground of your own land because it will stink for your neighbor. It spawns economic reactions of the kind of, okay, then you need a septic system. Okay, well, then you need to get the approval for your septic system. Oh, then you need to let the investigative agent of the state enter your home to check that you got your septic system. And so even very small laws, they are roots for huge invasions of liberty and huge huge modifications of the neutral role of the state, even if the law itself appears to be neutral or appears to leave freedom operate. That's why I'm very hesitant whenever it comes to laws that shape the economic system. But you are right. Companies like Google could be argued to be spun off of the state. They could be argued essentially to be a delegated surveillance agent of the state, and it wouldn't be a much of a leap to say that, to the extent that Google is very collaborative with state agents, to the extent that it suffices to have a FISA warrant of any kind, or even not a FISA warrant, but you can even have collaborations between Google and the FBI. You end up seeing that these economic systems, which they spawn off the voluntary will of people to adhere to their service, but then just the way they handle information is essentially at the service of the state in many cases.
Right. Well, that's totally true, and especially when you factor in that organizations like Amazon and Google have billions of dollars in federal and state contracts and subcontracts, where they are essentially the delegated agent to perform government work. I mean, there are divisions within these organizations, and I'm not sure the extent of Twitter and Instagram, for example, but I know that Google and Amazon have extensive government contracts, and they are subject to federal law with respect to their compliance. We covered this last week with respect to the diversity industry and the need to comply with various affirmative action programs in hiring, in marketing, and in a broad suite of other initiatives. So you have entities that are already public-private. That is, they're part of a public coalition. So this utopian, clean concept that libertarians like to start from in their economic models of private enterprise, I think doesn't even get off the ground because they're not private. They're not private in terms of their ownership. And I would like to actually sort of formalize an internet bill of rights and have a kind of formal document to circulate around the internet within the next week or two. And this is a little bit of a warm up to that. But what I guess the point that I'm trying to build towards is that you can't have the starting assumption of private companies is false in about 50 different directions. And it's like starting an economic model with an assumption that's, with a faulty assumption, you can end up having, the what's called in chess, the scorpion's tail phenomenon, which is that you can something can look accurate for 1 move, 2 moves, 3 moves, 4 moves, but there's a sting at the end of it that exposes the flaw at the first move. And the farther out you go on that, the more you're sort of building your foundation on a house of cards. And
I do take issue with it, but before I express my issue, I forgot to mention there was a guest, radical capitalist, who has done a debate with Richard Spencer, and he was very intelligent when he came to our show, and he's currently in trouble. He got doxxed, he lost his job, and I will put in the chat the link to help him because he's essentially been now censored from GoFundMe. So he had started a GoFundMe to reach $5,000 to be able to react to this loss of income of his. And so he currently has been cut from even having a source of income through GoFundMe. And so please, if you were planning to send me money tonight, send it to Radical Capitalist instead. We need to react when the rights of people to make an income for their production on YouTube and on various platforms is affected by essentially false flagging campaigns that are organized by leftists and Antifa. I have put the link to the BTC address so you can send him Bitcoin, and I will also be putting the link to his PayPal account. Give money to NCAP today. and stand for the right of people to derive an income from the internet and to not be censored by flagging campaigns.
Yeah.
Now,
Well, that's actually, yeah. Oh, sorry,
did
Mark.
you have anything to add on this? Because
Oh, no, I think it's a great segue because it's exactly what we're going to be talking about.
all right, yeah, absolutely. Because that's one of the problem we will come to is what do we do with income generation uh, platforms, which are currently being one of the great targets because people cannot censor you at the IP level, at the root levels of the internet are relatively unaffected, although it's not totally true because there was a daily stormer attacks, there was an attack on the alt-right.com website of Richard Spencer, but generally, the base of the internet has still remained with some degree of neutrality, but the platforms, like the platforms for free expression like YouTube, Twitter, and the income generation platforms are one of the great targets of our political enemies. And by making a wave of support to radical capitalists tonight, you can show these people that they're just going to lose business opportunities and you're going to find other ways to send your money. Now, on your attack of libertarianism, I would say it's a little misplaced. I understand everything you say, but I will say libertarians understand this. You will have Stefan Boliner replying to your attack, say, yes, we understand that under a huge state, the system of liberty is skewed such that, yes, there is no place for free competition under the authority of the state. That's precisely why libertarians want to destroy the state or reduce it to such a minimum that it cannot impede on the ability of people to provide competitive alternatives.
Well, then that gets you back to the question of how you define state, right? I mean, if you define a state as being the set of governmental organizations participating in the political network, which is run by a political part, by one of two in America and varied in different other countries and jurisdictions, but they are run by the political apparatchiks. And what has happened in the modern e-commerce world is that they are part and parcel of the public-private coalition. I mean, that's what you saw with, well, I mean, maybe I can make this a little bit narrower. Can you articulate what you think Stefan Molyneux's specific rebuttal would be?
Well, essentially, we would, and I would stand with him on this. We would tell you, yeah, yeah, we know it's a big problem. The fact that Google can have so much information on me and can share it with the state. Yeah, it's a big problem that platforms like Patreon can arbitrarily decide to censor specific people. But this problem, and the big problem is that under the laws of the state are favoring those monopolies and they are maintaining those monopolies. And if you had a true free system, if you had a true libertarian order, there would be place for people to compete. There will be 1,000 credit card processing companies instead of just one on the internet. And to that extent, it is the state that maintains a set of rules that keeps competition from showing up and that gives power essentially to these oligopoly.
Okay, so take, for example, the access to the financial system itself. Right.
Yeah.
And by the way, do you think there's a few angles here that I want to push against? So first is access to the financial system itself. So one of the things that government does is it ensures fair and equal access to credit markets. That's what the ECOA and the Community Reinvestment Act and other things we covered last week dealt with, although you might say that libertarians don't believe that those are legitimate, which is a fair point. But what you have right now is a lack of access to the entire market of money. So take, for example, what's happening with online credit card processing.
Yeah.
You have now the inability for digital dollars to be processed if you hold a certain political opinion. Okay,
Absolutely.
this is the classic place where you could have legislation that calls for basically a public utility function for online credit card processors. Or and there's lots of nudging you could do that I think comports well with the libertarian sense. For example, you could have mandatory transparency and disclosure requirements that don't necessarily induce forcible changes, but provide a public ledger of the political affiliations and donors of those who are in charge of credit card processing. So, in the same way that you have, for example, on OpenSecrets.com and other political activity, you could basically create lots of nudges. If you remember, the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act started with having reporting requirements and transparency, and then scorecards on the basis of it. It didn't actually compel loans to be made, but what that does is that places market pressure to be accountable. That way, you don't have to have here it drips, right? Like all of the ridiculous things that Twitter and Facebook and Google, YouTube have been doing. The information drips because they don't have these transparent reporting requirements where it's all there that regulators or oversight committees can see with respect to the political impact, the disparate impact of their policies on political speech.
Wait, Frame
And
Games, I want to make sure that I understand where you're headed. Are you headed toward telling me that we could start a fight in the legal system to get Richard Spencer replatformed on Patreon on the basis of discrimination with discrimination laws?
It would depend. Well, yes, in the sense of the same way that California. So California has I think we've covered this before on the program. California has a unique law, for example, that was designed to protect communists in the 1950s that prohibits discrimination, employment discrimination against, again, on the basis of political viewpoint. Right. And now James Damore is trying to use that to say, well, hey, now you're attacking me because I'm right wing. And that's why I was fired. And there are causes of action on the basis of that. But I'm not actually making a sort of a discrimination argument with respect to Richard Spencer legally. It's more, and as we move into the material here, there's a 2017 Supreme Court case that's very promising for exactly this issue. And it wouldn't necessarily be Patreon if Patreon doesn't meet the threshold for being a social media company, a large cap social media company. So one of the ways that commerce regulation of large commercial entities operates is through the creation of tiers, whereby beyond a certain market capitalization, certain reporting thresholds or certain disclosure thresholds might kick in. So a famous example of this was after Enron in 2001, 2002, the famous accounting scandal case where the seventh largest company in the world, the major energy company, Enron, had this massive accounting scandal. And Andy Fastow and all those guys went to jail for a long time, surprisingly, just because it's rare for white collar criminals to be criminally prosecuted that way, for the most massive accounting scandal in American history. And in the aftermath of that, a sweeping set of legislation called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed, and that created all of these disclosure and reporting and compliance obligations on public companies that might not sit well with libertarians, but it was supported by Republicans. This was the Bush era, on the basis that everyone recognized that the market here was being totally destroyed. So, isn't it? Can I go into this a little bit, or do you?
Absolutely, we can go into this.
There's a great documentary on the Enron scandal that I encourage libertarians to watch. not because I agree with its message in total, but because it really did open my mind up to a lot of arguments I hadn't considered. And it's called Enron, the smartest guys in the room. And because that was the nickname for these accounting wizards who were able to use a lot of tricks that were permitted under the law at the time to move around assets and create the appearance of having much more money than they did. So one of the things that was unique about Enron is that they were an energy company, and they created something, I think it was called the Enron market, and they created basically a trading market, a futures trading market on energy prices and on the prices of different commodities tied to energy. And then what they would do is because they were an energy company that had control over whether or not there were brownouts in an area, they could single-handedly go long on the price of various proxies for the price of energy in a region, and then turn off a power plant in that region, and then immediately cash in on the fact that their futures had now tripled or quadrupled in value. Now that's very dirty, right? But a libertarian, most libertarians, even all but the most ardent ones, I won't say all the most ardent ones, because it's like SJWs, like in a sense, there are ones who are just totally crazy and would be fine just pooping in the woods for the next and going back to the Stone Age that way. But most libertarians believe in the public utility doctrine. That is, utilities, those entities which are so critical to the infrastructure of life on Earth, such as electrical power or water, do not have the same rights and entitlements as private enterprise, such as like a lemonade stand, right? If the lemonade stand just shuts down business, you can go to another lemonade stand. If the public utility company shuts off your water and your power, then that's it for you and your kids. I mean, especially if you're poor, that can be fatal. I mean, if you can imagine, if it's in the middle of winter, you're in Minnesota, and then you made a racist comment, so now your public utility, the utility company shuts off your heat. Well, they just killed you, right? So, I mean, what's your position on that? I guess before I proceed on this.
Well, my position is that the public utility doctrine, I'm for it. I do not think it's a violation of libertarian principles, because I think if you dig, because it shows up as the public utility doctrine in our society, but what it really is you can justify this outcome, the doctrine itself, with libertarian principles. You could argue, for example, that Enron or that an electricity company that would shut down certain voices, certain asses because of reason A, B, C, or because it wants to manipulate other markets and benefit from it in some other way, that they are essentially engaging in a non-consensual relationship with the customer, and that they are practicing extortion. It's like, I'm going to give you electricity, but then I'm going to remove it, and then I'm going to benefit from you in that other way. And to that extent, this could be construed as criminal extortion, as a violation of the consensual ability of customers to consent. And so to me, I agree with the principle, and I don't think it's a problem for libertarianism.
Well, what if the utility company had a clear terms and services provision that provided that in order to receive power from this company, you need to consent to our terms and services that provide that if you articulate hate speech, as we define it, or as defined herein, then we have the right to terminate your power with no further notice?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Personally, I tend to agree that there should be no discrimination based on political ideology. There, I will recognize that it's a kind of departure from per libertarianism. Per libertarianism would give the right to the power company not to do that kind of terms of service. But again, you could argue, based on certain concepts of libertarianism, you could argue that essentially the power company being a monopoly and essentially ecologically invading all of the possibilities that human beings have to live on this earth. You could argue that it's still extortion, that essentially the company is forcing a political ideology for no reason at all. And it is using its power to keep you alive for doing so. And so you could have an extreme argument where it is ecological terrorism of some kind, where they're essentially taking all of the spaces that are heated and powered, and they're telling you you're either gonna die or you're gonna sign this denial of your own rights to free speech. And so these are border cases. They are the gray area of libertarianism. Personally, I tend to stand for not allowing these companies to do that kind of arbitrary classification of hate speech and stuff like this.
Well, it wouldn't be a monopoly, though, right? What if it just so happened that all 4 or 5 of the utility companies providing power in your area and in every area, they just so happened to adopt a standard ADL style anti-hate speech terms and services, and there's no monopoly, right? I mean, under the Sherman Antitrust Act, under our current in America, our trust busting legislation, you need to have between 70 and 80% market share in order for a antitrust action to be brought against you. Now, how you define market share, how you define industry, that is the market share in that industry, is often where the magic happens, because you can narrowly define a specific niche industry where Facebook might have 80% market share, although you wouldn't say they have 80% market share over social media if you include things like YouTube and Twitter and Instagram, although Instagram, I guess, is technically owned by them. But the point I'm building towards is that I don't think you would have grounds under a libertarian conception of monopoly of antitrust legislation, because this is happening relatively organically through the public-private coalition that has developed, whereby these companies are often major contributors to political allies who have a political agenda against hate speech. And those entities who attempt to compete and service customers who are engaged in quote-unquote hate speech are not provided access to the financial system because of an inability to process digital money. So you understand you couldn't bring an antitrust case again. That's the situation we're in now. You can't bring antitrust necessarily against these companies because no single one or single network has 70 to 80% market share in the social media industry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to push that much back because I don't even believe in my side of the debate. In other words, I'm just trying to push back to you for the purpose of autism, but I'll keep doing it because I enjoy it. As far as my use of the word trust goes here, it was really a concept of trust, and it wouldn't matter to me that there's 5 or 6 companies involved. I didn't mean trust in the sense of the current law. I meant that there is an entity that somehow coordinates, and we could argue that you're 5 or 6 companies that would adhere to the same rules, that they are participating to a civil conspiracy, whether it's intentional or not. And so I think that my arguments still stand in a very extreme and autistic way, but I would also offer a second argument, which is that the terms of service that they would enter in with people would be enforced by some sort of state, some sort of judge, some sort of ruler. And the fact is that this state would probably be bound, even if it's a monarchic state, it would probably be bound by not employing the use of force, not employing its own decisional power and judiciary power to discriminate based on political ideology. So the condition that's in the terms of service of these companies could be ruled in court to be unenforceable, if you will. The same way that there are many unenforceable things in various contracts. I could enter in a contract with a woman, for example, that says that if we have babies and she leaves the home, that I'm going to have 100% of the custody time with the child for the rest of their life. If I go to a judge with that contract and I say, hey, she signed that at the moment of producing the child, the judge will just say that's a non-enforceable condition of the contract. We could say the same of any sort of hate speech considerations under a First Amendment-like protection.
Well, right. Well, that's exactly what public utilities are subject to. It's one of the reasons that they're forbidden from law, from turning off your, in an era of I'm not going to say Alexa, but I have one in my room. But or Google Home, where the smart refrigerator hears you speaking to your wife. I mean, in an era where your refrigerator could process your hate speech and then shut down shut down your entire plumbing system, as punishment. That's one of the things that a public utility is forbidden from doing, precisely because of that public policy reason. But I have never seen an example of hate speech terms and services being challenged on those grounds. That is, I mean, really, that's the set of legislation being currently challenged right now in the Twitter lawsuit. As my understanding is, one of the theories of the case that they're bringing is exactly that. But otherwise, you'd have to show coercion. You'd have to show that your consent was involuntary. But all the utility company would need to do is say, there's no monopoly here. You could go to 7 or 8 other utilities in the area. So there's no monopoly, both theoretically or geographically, and so there's no involuntary aspect of it, and there's no public policy legislation currently that forbids social media companies from the kinds of regulations that public utilities are subject to. And what I'm saying is, because of the unique adaptations of this political complex in the past several years, whereby access to the financial system itself is now cut off, then there is a unique role for the comptroller's office, for the FCC, for any number of regulatory bodies to step in and say, no, we need to provide access to digital payments online. Because the problem right now is, if a new utility were to come in and try to service it, well, then you simply wouldn't be able to process credit card transactions. You would have Visa and MasterCard team up with Stripe and PayPal, and boom, there goes your ability to participate in internet commerce, in the e-commerce age. And
I absolutely agree with you. That's why we do need something, a sort of either legislation or a competitive entity that will be accepting payments of all kind for anything that is not criminal.
Right. And these entities, you have to remember, are already highly regulated, especially with respect to diversity regulations. So, none of these companies are able to discriminate in any way, shape, or form, whether internally or externally, whether implicitly or explicitly, on the basis of race, creed, national origin, disability, military status, political viewpoints.
That was my question to you. Does that include political ideology? And because there are some discrimination laws in Canada, for example, that include religion, race, but not political ideology. So what's the state of this in the US?
There are practically no protections for political ideology. I mentioned California has that sort of unique communist protection statute. And there are some obscure ones like it sort of scattered throughout American jurisprudence. But for the most part, political ideology is not protected. And certain protections that used to be in place have been scaled back, such as the FCC's fairness doctrine, which elements of it I certainly don't agree with. But what we're trying to ensure here is access to the financial system itself. That is, when you're talking about think about how many alternatives to the current state of social media and the current state of access to the political system. That is, we just had a court ruling that President Trump cannot block journalists on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because of the First Amendment. But you have a situation where Twitter itself can block journalists. And that's one of the points I want to make in the presentation, is that in this era, everyone is a journalist. You are a journalist. I am a journalist. If it is unconstitutional for Trump to block a journalist from Twitter, how is it constitutional for Twitter to block you and me, from access to what the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 is essentially a public forum? And that's one thing I wanted to discuss with you, is a recent Supreme Court case with some very interesting dynamics that I think could be used to create the public policy basis for an Internet Bill of Rights.
All right, let's have a look at this Supreme Court case after the 2 super chats. Mr. Fahrenheit sends $5. He says, "What got him fired?" He's talking about radical capitalists. "I believe I missed that episode. Was he openly white nationalist? Donated to him, by the way." That's the amazing thing with radical capitalists. He's merely a sort of libertarian, from my understanding. He argued with Richard Spencer. He didn't say anything. He didn't even appear as if he was some sort of white nationalist even. I would say he was just an out there libertarian with not a single controversial view in the entire episode. And so he was fired probably because people have sent letters to his employers that said that he was a Nazi and a right-winger and an alt-righter. I don't know exactly, but it looks like this. And we will have Radical Capitalist tomorrow on the show to clarify the situation. And Padre Speaks says, Enron's ability to get mark-to-market treatment is what set them apart. It let them declare a deal for whatever they said it was worth.
Right, that's true too. That's what I played into it, yep.
Wonderful. So this Supreme Court case, I'm very eager to hear about it because I really like Supreme Court case, although it's sometimes depressing to see liberty being not so well defended, but sometimes there are good news. So what's happening in this case?
This is a white pilling one. So in the presentation that I sent you, it's if you just start at A and then it's about the 7th slide. I can kind of. Do you want me to start with it, or do you want me to sort of proceed? Because we're gonna get there sort of on the way to the other points I wanted to cover. But I'm happy to start there first if you'd prefer.
Absolutely, let's start there. And then there's also net neutrality, because normally when we talk about Internet Bill of Rights, we've been talking about net neutrality a lot. Will that be on the table today, later?
A little bit. So in the context of a favorable FCC, I mean, I love Ajit Pai, the new FCC commissioner. I think he's absolutely fantastic. So I actually have like a clip of his like trolling video about net neutrality in here.
Okay.
But this is, if you skip to where we are, and then it's slide 5, and it's called The Age-Old Debate. What's worse, racism versus child molesters?
Oh, God. Did the Supreme Court rule on the question?
Well, they ruled on the question of kitty fiddlers. They ruled on the. I mean, it's amazing that it all comes together like this, right? I did a stream earlier this week where I lamented the fact that the far left has racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, bigotry, Islamophobia. Like they have a million different parade of commas, right? Just one after another that they can get you fired for. And we have one thing: child molestation. That's it. That's all we got. It's a big gun, but it's doing a lot of work, surprisingly. So,
oh God.
So this was a case from June 19th, 2017. I don't know if you're on it. I have the relevant citations at the bottom, and then I just put images of the facts of the case and various other things on it on the slide there. So I'm just going to go through the images and take you through the case. So Lester Packingham was convicted of taking quote, indecent liberties with a minor in 2012 as a 21-year-old college student. Per North Carolina law, he was sentenced to 10 to 12-month imprisonment, followed by 24 months supervised release. He was also, apart from being told to remain away from the minor, there were no special stipulations around his sentencing. And then he was arrested in 2010 after authorities came across a post on his Facebook profile thanking God for having a parking ticket dismissed. You're probably wondering how this got to the Supreme Court. Well, it turns out that there was a North Carolina law regarding convicted sex offenders, which had a lifetime bar of access to social media websites.
Wow.
Okay, so North Carolina had the state law that said if you are convicted of any sex offense, any felony sex offense in the book, then for the rest of your life, you are barred from social media. You can't have a Facebook account, you can't have an Instagram account, you can't have Twitter.
I wasn't aware of that. That seems, I mean, I don't want to come to the defense of the child abusers, but it does seem abusive.
Right. Well, you can, depending on your conception of what social media is going to define, is going to sort of limit the parameters of constitutionality here. Mm-hmm. And so both the majority and the concurring opinions of the justices here are extremely interesting and I think very promising, especially the majority opinion. So the question before the Supreme Court was, does this North Carolina law violate the First Amendment? So this is a First Amendment case arguing that, is prohibiting someone from social media when a state does it, is that against the First Amendment? So you can see that there's a distinction here. Right. There's a distinction here between, Twitter, Facebook, and the state of North Carolina. Right. I mean, that's, we acknowledge up front. But let me see if I can read a few other relevant facts to you, or if I should just kind of read these in order of the images. Well, okay, I'll skip to the punch here. So the Supreme Court, he was found guilty in the lower courts. The lower courts upheld the North Carolina law, and he appealed it, and the Supreme Court granted certiorari, which is lots of cases in the docket. Supreme Court only accepts a very small percentage of cases, and they accepted this one, and they overturned the lower court's ruling, and by an 8-0 decision. So
just to be clear, was it a divisive decision in the Court of Appeal, or did he obtain the permission from the Supreme Court to submit his case?
Right. So he sued, saying it violates the First Amendment. The lower court said no, this is constitutional, and you're going to jail. And then he appealed it to the Supreme Court, which has a very small chance of being accepted.
Okay, so he didn't go through a Court of Appeal before.
No, he did. You go through a lower court, and then an appeals court, and then the Supreme Court.
Okay. But that's my question. The appeals court, was it a split decision?
I'm not sure. I don't have the info in front of me, and I don't want to speculate. But it was, typically appellate courts have 3 to 5 judge panels, and I'm not sure if it was a majority or unanimous decision.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it's going to be a North Carolina court that he's suing in, so they might have, it can be difficult to overturn state law within the state, which is one of the reasons that the Supreme Court is federal.
Yeah.
But it was a unanimous decision, 8-0 by the Supreme Court. I think one of the justices recused himself. And the court held that in order to be valid under the First Amendment, a content-neutral regulation of speech must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest. In this case, although the government had a legitimate interest in protecting children from abuse, this law too broadly restricted access to all sorts of websites. If it were limited only to social media websites, the law would still unconstitutionally restrict speech because of the vast number of functions that social media websites perform in the modern world. And here's where it gets interesting. I'm going to talk about the concurring opinion last here. So here was Here was the majority opinion that 5 out of the 8 justices said. Social media users employ these websites to engage in a wide array of protected First Amendment activities on topics as diverse as human thought. Social media allows users to gain access to information and communicate with one another about it on any subject that might come to mind. By prohibiting sex offenders from using these websites, North Carolina, with one broad stroke, bars access to what for many are the principal sources of knowing current events, checking ads for employment. That's another actually interesting challenge with respect to requiring, prohibiting lifetime bans. Is you could have is access to employment, especially if it turns out that minority groups are disproportionately banned. That's an interesting theory I hadn't thought of. But speaking and listening in the modern public square, and otherwise exploring the vast realms of human thought and knowledge, these websites can provide perhaps the most powerful mechanisms available to a private citizen to make his or her voice heard. To foreclose access to social media altogether is to prevent the user from engaging in the legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights. That is some powerful language here, because they use the key phrase public square. So that is something that social media companies have fought against for a considerable period of time, so that they are not treated as neutral platforms that have to permit speech that basically are barred from censorship in the same way that public utilities are. The idea behind sort of modern First Amendment legislation is that the public access to the public square has to be protected. And social media companies have sort of countered this, and their advocates, especially on the left wing, have countered this by saying, well, it's not the public square. The public square is your local park. It's a physical space. There's not yet legal precedent to say that cyberspace is the public square. But you have this radical opinion that's as fresh as a year ago saying to the contrary. Now, the thing that's most frustrating about this to me is that was the 5-0 majority opinion. The 3-0 concurring opinion was by the right-wing justices. That is Roberts, Thomas, and Alito, saying that the majority opinion erred in going too far by equating the entire internet with a traditional public forum. So they still agreed it was excessive in this case, but they did not concur with a majority opinion, which is the binding law of the land, that the internet is the public forum. But that is
so the
really
right-wingers in the Supreme Court are not even standing for the public conception of social media.
Yeah, it's maddening, right? Like,
they were my only hope. Now I'm torn apart by what I hear about this case from you, Frame Games. I would like to have glorious music that celebrates this victory for freedom, but at the same time, we're talking about a kid diddler.
Right, but that is the question. I mean, really, the dichotomy, that defines the current battle lines of the two most powerful forces on Earth is like anti-racism and anti-pedophilia. Like, the winner of that battle is going to determine like the next 30 years of modern history in the West.
I'm depressed just thinking about it.
But we got a shot, man. Like, it's getting us pretty far.
We don't have a shot if the right-wing justices are not even on our side, and they're alarmed by the use of the term public square for social media. And by the way, they almost use public space. Look at this.
That's funny.
They say the court states that cyberspace and social media in particular are now the most important places in a spatial sense. They could have said the public space.
Yeah. Well, that is funny. That's the public space is ground zero for this.
Sargon has been using the term public space instead of public square. Thanks, Sargon, for the publicity.
It's very useful. It's a very useful phrase.
Yeah, because it's not a square anymore. It's bits and wires, and so it's the public space.
Yeah, I Frame Games approved.
All right.
But there's a lot of other great language in here. Here a commercial social networking website is defined as any website that facilitates the social introduction between two or more persons for the purposes of friendship, meeting other persons, or information exchanges. And I mean, this is a broad definition, and they literally say in the most recent Supreme Court case that the First Amendment rights apply to these websites that are so integral to the fabric of modern society and culture. That is an acknowledgement that we didn't have before. So the question is, are courts going to be willing to take the next step? And are activists and Republican, politicians like Trump, like Matt Gaetz, like the others who are, starting to get behind this now because they recognize how important it is for the 2018 midterms. There is a moment in history now where we have momentum to potentially put some legislation forward, and it doesn't even need to be landmark legislation. This can be done by executive order. This can be done through minor changes to the way subcontracting and federal contracting is done. Like later in the presentation, I wanted to get to comparisons to anti-BDS legislation and how the government can, without directly regulating companies, so I can preserve the pristine libertarian virginity here, just change the incentive structure by saying that you can't. Okay, that's fine. If you don't have an internet bill of rights in your terms of service, or if you don't provide transparency with respect to the appeals process, with respect to the political affiliations and political donations of all trusted flaggers and those who sit on the boards of appeals with respect to online censorship, if you do not have this protective language, then you are restricted. Then you are not able to participate in federal or state contracts or subcontracts. I mean, that would immediately gut Amazon and Google, as well as an incredible range of e-commerce websites. They would be forced to put in the same kinds of terms and services that the ADL and the DNC twisted the arms of Facebook and Google and YouTube to put in place in 2014 in the first place. It wouldn't be that much damage. You wouldn't need to take a sledgehammer to it. This could be done with a scalpel, and the ways for doing that I want to articulate here.
Very interesting. I'm totally for it. I will say, as a libertarian, when I talk about issues that are to be solved in current society, I don't mind using the state. It's not like because I'm a libertarian, I don't want to pass any law. I recognize that we are in a world that is not non-libertarian, and to that extent, non-libertarian solutions can be pragmatically useful in the current world.
Yeah. So then I also wanted to talk about the pragmatic aspect of this, which is something that I think probably distinguishes me sort of most dramatically from like libertarian purists, is that I very much have the Saul Alinsky school of getting shit done in my mind when I think about this, because the winners write history. So if you want grandkids, if you want, like, you can always atone for your sins when the victory is won. But I want to just take a little tour of where we're headed if we don't get if we don't get an internet bill of rights, if we do not have a strong arm, if we do not have a legislative or an executive or a judicial remedy to the current state of things. Here's where we are. So, I have here on slide 2, in case you wanted to see it. The first one is that libertarianism is not a wartime consigliere. Right. This is the Godfather quote. When Tom Hagen is the sort of like iconic consigliere, the chief advisor to the mafia, to the Godfather in the Godfather trilogy.
Okay, so this is really in the movie? They talk about libertarianism? Yes.
Well, no, but I'm drawing an analogy.
It was my impression. That was a little weird.
Sorry, there's an analogy that's sort of directly, which is, what do you do about principles? Like, what is the role of principles in war? right? Because one of the things I was going to get to in the presentation towards the end was that Abe Lincoln shut down over 300 newspapers during the Civil War by accusing them of treason. Here, I put it at the end here. It's a pretty amazing quote where Abe Lincoln says, and this is Abe Lincoln, the number one most iconic president in American history. And what he did, here is his executive order from 1864. I can just read it to you, but if you wanted to see it, you'd have to refresh the thing. It's on slide 10. And here is the 1864 executive order by Abraham Lincoln calling for it's titled Arrest and Imprisonment of Irresponsible Newspaper Reporters and Editors. Here's the executive order to Major General John A. Dix, commanding at New York. Whereas there has been wickedly and traitorously printed and published this morning in the New York World and New York Journal of Commerce, newspapers printed and published in the city of New York, false and spurious claims. I mean, this is literally throwing the president invoking an executive order to imprison journalists for fake news. All I'm saying is there's a legal precedent. Abe Lincoln. That's all I'm saying. And commanding the army to take possession of these printing establishments by military force until further orders and prohibit any further publications therefrom. So that is an example of the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, having to recognize that when you're at war, the operating principles that you might have during peacetime do not apply. And what my message, I guess, to libertarians is that once you have this legislation in place, you will have the comfort to be able to go back to your principles and give way as the pendulum swings back. And there will be a natural, back and forth between the right and the left. But what you are heading for right now is death. This is China. And I wanted to get into the example of China and the limits of libertarianism in a second here. But the iconic line from Godfather is, Tom, you're not a wartime consigliere. We need a different advisor at peacetime than at war. And this is the kind of Hans Hermann Hoppe libertarianism with teeth that I think many libertarians have been moving towards. And I would like to encourage the rest of them to join.
Absolutely, I'm all for it, and I'm all for this journey. And as Coach Red Pill once said to Sargon of Akkad in a Skype conversation, everything is fair in love and war.
Yeah, that is true. So on the next slide, I just wanted to take a little tour of the future. So libertarianism is how you get China. If you do, this is a classic hawks and doves problem where left-wing authoritarianism is a hawk. And while you may have more value as a dove when you are in a world of doves, when you are in a world of hawks, you have to be a hawk as a preemptive defensive measure. So what happened in China is, here's a great example.
So what number of slide is that? So I can show it?
This is number 2. It's called Do You Want China? And there is a link in there to a Business Insider article. And I'll throw this in the Hangout too, in case you want to jump to it. And this is a list of banned words in that Chinese social media implemented during the period in which its president, Xi Jinping, declared an end to its constitutional term limits so that he could be president forever. So I thought it would be fun for the chat to see the list of banned words. So if you just kind of scroll through and take a tour, I'm going to draw an analogy to the current set of banned words. So you'll see in this article, I'll pull it up myself here. Let
I
me know if you're on it.
oppose.
Yeah. Okay.
Disagree. Personality cult. 1984 was bad.
Yes. So here's the context for this. So there's a Twitter equivalent in China called Weibo, and what happened was they banned all of these words. If you typed these words on Weibo in China, 1.8 billion people, if you typed these words, then you were banned from social media.
That's still in effect.
I think that it was rescinded or scaled back after the constitutional law was changed.
Okay.
But I'm not sure the extent to which it's still there. But these are all of the banned phrases. They even banned the letter N from the keyboard.
The letter N, so that you cannot
Yeah.
say N word.
Yeah. Well, it was for no. It was the equivalent of anything relating to negation or no. So here's a list of words. I oppose, disagree, personality cult, 1984, Animal Farm, Emperor's Dream, My Emperor, Named Emperor, slavery, shameless, emigrate, incapable ruler, Disney. The word Disney was banned. Winnie the Pooh, because he looks like Winnie the Pooh, and people were making Winnie the Pooh memes. So they ascend the throne, to board a plane, because people were talking about emigrating and changing trains. Go against the tide was banned. I mean, all of these rule the world. I mean, it's just word after word after word. Now, people who are maybe newer to this space, and why I think that this is why I call for this with such full-throated activism, and I'm saying, and I, even though I recognize tension with libertarian beliefs, it is absolutely suicidal to proceed as a purist libertarian in the modern context, is because if you look up the ADL hate symbol database, which I think we've covered on a prior stream here, but here it is again, just because I think it bears ingraining into the human mind for everybody here. I want you to tell me, and I just put it in the Hangouts, how different that list of banned words is from the ADL hate symbol database.
I mean, it's even more extensive. The ADL starts with numbers.
Yeah, here's a
Alabama.
list of, 111 is banned as a hate symbol. 100%, 12, 13, 14, 1423, 1488, 18, 212, 212, 211 crew, 23 the hand sign, 23 divided by 16, 28 318. All of these. Do you understand social media? Every single social media company, whether you're talking about Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, SoundCloud, all of these have signed the ADL pledge with respect to the terms of services that provide for expulsion from the platform for using hate speech or hate symbols as provided in the ADL hate speech database in an act of commerce, or giving you basically the ability to unilaterally throw you off the platform if you use any of these in a way that could be construed as using them in the context of their symbolic nature. So these are all banned words. But the thing is, this is because there is the modern context of so-called private companies is one in which they are all engaged in the political game. These companies are major campaign contributors to left-wing DNC, DNC organizations, or political, literal, like Hillary for America style super PACs. I mean, obviously right wingers do it too, although in different fields, not so much ones that regulate speech. And so these are public companies in the sense that they are engaged in the public-private coalition that is the domain of public companies. So there is no difference between the ADL hate speech database and what's going on right now in China for functional purposes. Like, for example, you can't get on the Apple iTunes store. You can't get on the Google Play Store if you have a hate symbol here. right? They banned Pepe, and they have liberty to do so with respect to anything here, and are effectively, compulsorily obligated to do so. So the question is, what power do you have as a libertarian to stop this if your only alternative is denied access to the financial system? I mean, right now, the only thing out there that still has access to the financial system is like Gab, and that's only because they haven't gotten big enough yet. Look what they did to Maker Support. Look at what they did to Freestarter. These are literal fundraising organizations, like explicit companies for the purpose of fundraising, but they don't have access to the financial system because of the oligopoly with respect to payment processors, digital money processors. So I think a brand new paradigm has to enter the mind of libertarians, which I think is actually very fitting because libertarianism went through several ages with respect to its conception of money itself. You had the gold age, right? All money was physical. 1970.
I remember
What?
that. I remember that, and then I remember Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I remember. Yeah, but that's how far we've come. But I mean, I've been in these libertarian circles with these libertarian groups. I mean, and the old guard is still whining about Nixon taking us off the gold standard in 1971 and asking for their money back. I mean, that's what they're talking about. This is the old money. And that's why one of the white pills I have in the presentation is that old people are going to die. I mean, I say this like lovingly, like, rest in peace, like, thank you for your contributions. But there is a new conception of what money is and of what the public space is. And we are now coming of age in that new paradigm, right? 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard, and that forever got rid of that permanently altered the Misesian, the Mises, Milton Friedman conception of money as being, this hard-backed, intrinsically valuable thing. Right, because now it became, well, what is the creditworthiness of the federal government, and the fact that all money was backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. Treasury.
Yeah,
and then that entered the era of printed money rather than physical money. And then with the age of computing, we enter the age of digital money, and we are now somewhere between sort of digital money and potentially. I hope that the cryptocurrency market continues to develop. I have a lot of side issues with it, but we are in a world now. Remember, I showed you that graph of all the money in the world, and there's only like $5 trillion total worldwide in physical money, even though there's hundreds of trillions of dollars when you include the digital money plus futures plus debt, which is all digital. The physical money is nothing. And what you're limiting people now to is physical money. There needs to be, you don't have to regulate per se, at least as a foot in the door. For us to generate noise on social media, whether that's through a hashtag campaign, whether that's through a targeted campaign of going after a specific influencer like Matt Gaetz, the Republican congressman who launched Fire in Hell over Twitter last week and got Trump's attention over this. There's a moment in history where we can color the national conversation. If we can get Lauren Southern talking about this, right? If we can get Stefan Molyneux talking about this, and literally just providing protections at the payment processor level, that alone would probably preserve a lot of libertarian and right-wing principles, because all you're doing is defending access to digital money, right? And you're saying, well, payment card processors cannot censor on the basis of political viewpoint, absent a call for violence, like a specific call for violence, something that violates a U.S. law. I mean, you can tie it to the law itself. These are the kinds of things that wouldn't even get Facebook directly. Like, it wouldn't compel Facebook or YouTube to change necessarily, but it would open the door for competitive markets to emerge because they suddenly have access to capital because they can't be discriminated against for not having hate speech in their terms of service. Do you understand? There's a lot of other propositions I have on this, but I wanted to make that point.
I fully agree with that. Now, what would be the strategy? We just need to talk about this issue and get what would be the form of what would be satisfying. Are we talking about a law at the federal level?
Yes, I think what you do is you have the broad suite of candidate changes that can be legislative, or they can be through executive order. So, for example, Trump can pass an executive order that compels the FCC to abide by certain guidelines, and he's done this a lot. And you can let me go through some specific what I would say like scalpel changes to on insofar as what to do. So on slide 9 here's just a couple. And I'd like to turn this into a formal document that I can circulate, try to keep it to about 2 or 3 pages in total, but put some sweet-ass letterhead on it that doesn't have anything to do with me, and try to get an influencer that's 1 or 2 grades above us in terms of subscribership to co-sign on to this. That way it starts getting press attention, and then you start getting either local or state or ideally federal legislators to at least take a look at it. So I thought there were lots of limitations to Paul Nealon's shall not censor legislation. Did you ever end up taking a look at that when he?
No, tell me about it.
So I'll send you a link to it in case you want to pull it up, and so the chat can actually know, what he articulated the basis for it was there. I have a different conception of it. I think, but it is useful to see what kinds of things have been done so far to show how to do it better. So, this thing got a little bit of traction, got a little bit of press attention, and then Nealon went Nealon, right? Is what it is. I'm not counter signaling or whatever, but it just, it became, people don't talk about this particular thing anymore because it was, they shot the messenger, so to speak.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not weighing in on that one way or the other. There are a lot of, it's beyond the scope of this. But so he issued this in a website press release that was tied to him. You see, here's all that you have on his shall not censor legislation. It's just there's no letterhead on it. There's no list of signatories. There's no, and this is the kind of thing that you want a consensus built around. What Jewish organizations do when they try to pass this legislation is they say, this has been signed by over 5,000 and climbing, including, these influencers, these business, owners, these legislators at this level. And he basically just said that the First Amendment free speech protections, protect speech online, so that it's illegal to shadow ban or demonetize or deplatform. And this is the kind of thing that, I would love it if we had it, but you can't take this to a legislator, and it's very hard for people who are 1 or 2 notches to the left or center of this sector of the internet to take this document and shop it around for consensus so that it can begin to snowball. Part of the reason is it's far too overbroad, and it doesn't deal with any of the contingency situations. It just says, well, everything's free speech now, and now there's let me sort of get into some things that I think would be gentler. So first, here on page 9 of the slides, you say that there is an Internet Bill of Rights, or however you want to define it, that kicks in once you pass a certain number of monthly active users or total profiles on a commercial social media platform. And here you can borrow directly from previous legislation in the EU. So not to make you hop around too much, but you'll see here on slide 3 of the presentation, part of what motivated the big crackdown in 2017 by social media was something called the NetzDG law in the EU. And here I'll send you a link to an article on this in the Hangouts if you're curious to check it out more specifically. But here's what they did. So, these far-right nationalist groups were growing in Europe in 2016, and there was pushback against all the immigration, and Brexit was underway. You had in Greece, Hungary, all these other nations. You had right-wing rising, and so the EU passed this sweeping set of that created these $50 million fines for hate speech up on their platform that censor them. I'm sorry, that if you don't censor hate speech, each single instance of hate speech left up on the on a public on a social media company's website for more than 24 hours, absent extenuating circumstances, was subject to a 50 million euro fine.
My God.
And it applied to all internet platforms with more than 2 million users. So it exempted all of the small fries, all of the mom and pops. Anyone who's not a giant is not considered public space. I think that this is an extremely fair and reasonable basis for creating a U.S. Bill of Rights that is the reverse of this. Now, this is not uncommon in the law, and that's why I think we're at a moment in history, especially with the recent momentum, to make a serious push for this. If we can focus fire, and if we can get the people above, like just one or two rungs above us, to start making noise around a specific set of demands. It has to be like 5-10 specific concrete points, the same way Black Lives Matter does, the same way the ADL does, not these general principles. Articulate very specific demands that a legislator who's only got 10 minutes to dedicate to this issue, when they're skimming what's on the docket or what their administrative aides brought to them that day, or what's trending when they're talking to their PR reps, that they can have a quick look. Okay, here's the 5 things. Here's the 10 things we demand. The 5 things are non-negotiable. You have to pass them if you want to get reelected. And show that you've got 10, 20, 50,000 signatures behind it. Put that on the on the document itself. And I'm just talking about things that we and folks in the chat, and things that could be done as an action item in a much more professional level than what's been done with respect to shall not censor and other sort of smaller attempts at this. But you could create a carve out, which is exactly the kind of thing that legislators want to be able to do to try to make it as narrow as possible. And you could start as a model and say So all right. So the next thing
we have that it kicks in at a certain size, but then what would it lead to?
Okay. So the first is just mandatory disclosure and reporting obligations on censorship activity, including number of accounts censored, and as well as information concerning the political affiliations and political donations to all organizations and principal individuals who are employed with respect to censorship and deplatforming activities on the social media, on the commercial social media site. So this is a very common foot in the door for regulatory oversight. What you say is, we're not compelling you to change your operations or to not censor people, but but you need to start providing data under the law that applies to large social media companies, that is, ones with 2 million or more users. And we'll give you a 6-month, 12-month grace period or whatever for it to kick in and for you to get your compliance department in order. And that way, what this will do is this has the immediate effect of creating public transparency and not have to rely on the David Seaman types or the Mike Cernovich types or the you and I types to get this, to leak this information on social media platforms so that it becomes public knowledge when we're shadow banned anyway. So our reach is limited no matter what. What I'm saying is this is what happened with the Community Reinvestment Act. And this is what happened with Sarbanes-Oxley. It starts with disclosure and reporting obligations. We're not changing the way you do business. We're just changing the kinds of disclosure you make to the public as a public company and as a large social media company participating in e-commerce. Does this make sense?
I like that. Yeah, as a libertarian, I object to that, but I like that in the current context. It's a little bit like label laws, laws that force you to put the ingredients of your recipe on your label. I think it makes sense. It's like don't make false representation, and if you do censor right wingers, you will be obligated to show it in a report.
Yep, and one of the great things about this is you can argue for much more aggressive policing, but you could settle on something like this. And one of the great things about this kind of foot in the door thing is it's very hard to form a non-libertarian argument against, right? I mean, they have this data. I mean, any large information technology social media company is going to have data on number of accounts. I mean, they're going to need that in their database. I mean, that's just going to be, they're going to have to manage that for their own Flagger programs and whatnot. And you could, I guess what I'm saying is this is a very small measure, but that would create so much ammunition for Koch brothers, for the Heritage Foundation, for Cato, for all of these, for Left Wing Watch, Judicial Watch. All of these organizations would suddenly have, a quarterly report that they could generate news cycles about with respect to trends in censorship and disparate impact with respect to what categories of accounts are getting censored.
Beautiful.
Now, and it's so subtle. And the thing is, how would you argue against that as a left winger?
The left winger will say, ultimately, you're trying to provide protection to haters.
Well, no, because this wouldn't be to haters. This would be as a consumer protection mechanism, so that individuals who sign up for your terms and services have to respect to its enforcement. And given the systemic problem of censorship online and limiting people from participation in the political process and in e-commerce, because of the role of social media companies with 2 million or more average monthly users, this is a consumer protection mechanism. It has nothing to do with racism or protecting racism. This is so that people have transparency with respect to how various terms are enforced, and you need that anyway because that's how every company has anti-discrimination laws in their terms of service. They're bound by EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission protections, and the same protections are in place there with respect to transparency. Like, you need to provide public data on a wide range of diversity data. I mean, particularly if you're a public company, there's no social media company with 2 million monthly, or at least there's very few with 2 million monthly active users that aren't public, right? I mean, you've got Facebook is public, Google's public, Twitter's public.
Very
I'm not
good.
sure about
that's a perfect argument. So we don't say that we will protect these people from being banned. We will just inform the consuming public about the features of the product they are consuming. Right.
Exactly. So I think that's a very powerful argument. But another one is creating transparency or more teeth in the appeals process, as well as creating maximum sentencing laws with respect to platforms that are mega social media companies. That is, if you are 2 million or more, there is going to be a statutory prohibition on lifetime bans. You can think of this as like laws against capital punishment, right? Right now, think about how many people are banned from participating in e-commerce or mega social media platforms under lifetime bans with no appeals process. I mean, you would never have this kind of thing in the context of of a public, I don't know, like a criminal case, or with respect to, or
we're
with
actually
respect to
more
government
lenient.
sanctions.
We're more lenient on actual criminals. We very rarely would give a life sentence, and even when we give life sentence, there are ways of reintegrating society. We're currently punishing people with life sentences who haven't even committed a crime.
Right, and one of the things that's really elegant about this kind of legislation is that there probably are a variety of protections against lifetime bans on all sorts of other race or gender related, non-identity politics related grounds, purely under the public policy recognition from the 2017 precedent that recognizes the critical importance of access to mega social media in the context of employment, access to advertisements and employments, access to information regarding political rights. I mean, there are lots of times where you're sort of directed to stay updated on various on various real-time developments by only through someone's sort of social media account. A lifetime ban could be interpreted as as violating a strict scrutiny protection under the First Amendment, where you could say you are allowed to ban people from your platform once you're north of a certain size. You can create tiers around it, right? Like maybe a lifetime ban if there is I don't know, like participation in like felony, or criminal, like explicitly criminal activity, and then you can create a second tier, where there are bans for up to 1 year or up to 3 years for tier 2. But these are the kinds of provisions that you could sort of consensus build around, because it might not be that bad for social media. Like social media companies might consider that to be a welcome reprieve from government oversight. And if you're threatening more extensive legislation, they might settle on that as the more reasonable grounds to say, okay, we'll prohibit lifetime bans except in the context of direct calls to violence or of conduct or behavior that violates state or federal law. Right. And then south of that, you can have, multi-year or multi-month bans. But that prohibits this ridiculous situation we're in now, where someone can make a post about David H-O-G and then another G after the end of it. And they are now totally limited for the rest of their life from participating in the American political process. And you have a Supreme Court majority opinion from just a year ago saying that the entire internet is a public forum and that this is critical fabric with respect to exercise and access to free speech protections. So to me, this is very, very accessible regulatory low-level things that can be done.
Absolutely. I would actually not concede ground on the lifetime ban possibility for criminal conduct, because even in light of the Supreme Court decision that you provided yourself, it doesn't seem like the state is allowed to even sanction lifetime bans of the overall platform. It seems that the state could say something like, well, you are allowed to use Facebook, but not for the purpose of violating the law, or not for the purpose of communicating with children. I think that there would have to be some narrowing down of the lifetime ban and what it applies to. So I don't even think we need to concede territory on this, and I would simply say lifetime bans are not permitted for any sort of censorship, and then it's a matter of what's legal under the Supreme Court decision, what could be the specifics of an order that would ban someone from doing a certain action on social media for life. Now, you also bring the point of appeals court, a bipartisan appeals court. It's very terrible that the appeals process of YouTube, of Patreon, of Twitter is all indulged by YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter.
Right. Right. And not only that, there's no transparency about it. And many times you have these, bipartisan appeals court, or you have some bipartisan oversight committee, that has, if not regulatory authority, then at least regulatory. They have data and insight with respect to these, to the appeals process itself. So that, I mean, if you look at this as a consumer protection problem, then then making it the consumer protection agencies, the CPA and all the other state equivalents and everything else a part of the consumer protection network it's intended to be bipartisan. It's intended to say we're going to protect you as a consumer, and these are rights that you have as an American, and this is something that I think could be tied a number of ways. So, for example, you could have licensing. One of the things that I mentioned before is you could start with a foot in the door in some favorable state like Texas or North Carolina or some sort of staunchly right-wing state or libertarian state. I was going to say New Hampshire, but I guess they're left-wing, and I was trying to make a joke about them being like the libertarian zone that is now getting diversified. But what you could do is you could start this here's the way Jewish organizations do this. And again, I say this with love and as a Jew. If they want to get shit passed federally, they start with, they start state by state, locality by locality, and then they can get it done federally once they've got 5 or 6 states in hand, once they've got 20 or 25 states in hand. Like what they've done right now with BDS, which is anti-BDS laws, which gave birth to like the HR 720, which is like the anti-free speech one. Sorry, I'm sort of going off into a bit of a tangent here. But what they do is they get states to tie funding and licensing to terms and services provisions, to affiliations with other networks. So if you remember in our talk about the archaeology of the Jewish Affinity Network, there are now 25 states that prohibit you from receiving federal funds, state funds, including state university funds in many of these states, if you are a spouse or are affiliated with organizations that are or espouse viewpoints calling for the boycott, divestment, or sanctions of resources from Israel. Mm-hmm. Right? It started state by state, and now it's up to 25 of them. So that's effectively federal. I mean, it's like getting Congress to do it. But what you do is you start small and you snowball, and they've done that over the course of 4 years, and now it applies halfway around the country. There are, especially as we enter the next election season, and Republicans want to win, right? I mean, this is appealing to self-interest here. If you can't get federal traction, start with favorable states. Start with favorable. Start at the local level if you can't get it done. If you can't get it done federally, and start to consensus build with basically. I mean, with this sort of ADL style of trying to get it done federally by getting it done in the state way first. And the beauty of that is that these organizations depend massively on local governments for licenses to operate, for federal and local contracts. Again, $500 billion industry. They take care of like the IT for a lot of government agencies. And if all of that could be tied to having a bipartisan appeals process, having mandatory disclosures and reporting obligations, transparency into the banning process, I mean that is a foot in the door. And once you've done that, you've established the principle. And then as the years, then you've at least got something to go on. Because right now we need to go from 0 to 1. So, I mean, I guess the main point is before you take it from 1 to 100, these are all things that can be done. Licensing, granting of licenses to operate, granting of federal public money, narrowly tailoring these provisions, are all ways that can be, they can be done in time for the 2018 election and create news cycles over it.
Now, there are some issues with this. First, the internet is a very international, and at least from the American perspective, a very interstate issue. And so, like if you had a law like this in New Hampshire, would there be any big internet companies bound by it?
If you had so you're saying if there's a state, I see what you're saying. So if there is a state, no, that's more in the context of licenses to operate in the state and receipt of of state grant money or of state.
But my point is, does Twitter operate in New Hampshire? Does Twitter receive funding from New Hampshire?
So the extent of it, I'm not sure. I would imagine that they have a license to, a business license to operate as part of the thing that you, well, I mean, I'm not sure. That's a good thing to look up, actually, is the specific regulations applicable to social media companies who are, because their money is all ad revenue. And I'm not sure, if you are doing a substantial amount of business in a particular state, you need to apply for what's called a foreign company, certificate of incorporation. You domicile yourself in a particular state like Delaware or New York or California, and then you get licenses to operate in all the places where you do a substantial amount of business, where substantial is defined according to each state law. And I'm not sure how much leverage a state has with respect to like a business license to operate, because I'm not sure if social media companies need to have, they don't have distributing warehouses in all 50 states like an Amazon. Like Amazon, I'm certain that they have licenses to operate in all 50 states, because they're not just Amazon.com. They're all the distributing warehouses. They're all the affiliate companies, relating to like local distribution. They're all of the other companies in network, like Whole Foods. Don't they own Whole Foods now, and all these other things? So, but that gets you leverage right there. I mean, that takes care of Amazon, and Google, I'm sure, is the same way. I mean, Google is all of these are conglomerates, so you could tie it that way. So my answer is yes, especially when you consider all the state contracts. I mean, think about like the state of Massachusetts or the state of New York. Now, obviously, these are harder states to get because they're left wing, but all of these organizations have IT needs. All of them, they have fundraisers, or they have, Google in some fashion, whether directly or indirectly, is operating, in coalition with at almost every level of government. I mean, whether that's relying on their infrastructure, or whether that's long-term agreements, whether that's tax incentive agreements. So, whenever Amazon comes to your city, you're going to have a tax abatement treaty, which is why there's so much, interstate negotiation with each other about who's going to get the next Amazon, warehouse. Like there was a big thing. Is it going to be Seattle? Is it going to be Toronto? Is it going to be Philadelphia? And they all negotiate with each other to try to kick the most bonuses. But that's all done through federal contracts. I mean, that you have Amazon or Google or Facebook on one side of the signature line, and the state or the city on the other side. And so every city contract gets in there too. So I think it could be very, very effective.
I think it's a very good plan from a theoretical perspective, but as a black-pilled French nihilist, man, we're faced with a brick wall there. First, even that actual legislation might be at odds with the current BDS legislation, which you are telling me is already up in 25 states.
Right.
Essentially, this legislation seeks to free the people who could speak against Israel, and then you have the legislation which already is in place, which keeps people from speaking about Israel. And so it's pushing this and being successful on this will be a hard thing. However, I'm willing to join the effort to the extent that I can, and I'm enthusiastic about it. I think the mandatory disclosure ID is really the minimal step, and it's beautiful in its simplicity. It is a very solid argument at the theoretical level. However, in practice, you will be faced with people saying that this is for maintaining hate speech on our social media. You will be faced with people who will say this is essentially a law that will approve racism. It's a tough fight.
It is, but that's also why I encourage I don't think that we are the best. I don't think we're the best spokesman for it, because I actually believe that a big tent philosophy for passing this legislation that would have a trickle-down effect on free speech for us is probably the best way in practice to achieve this, because there are a lot of centrists and liberals who do not like the oppressive state of social media. Like, we're not the only ones who get banned. I mean, we're just not. Like, it's very easy for us to get in our own sort of echo chamber about this stuff. But I do think that especially if there was a concerted effort to onboard people who are classical liberals, get your Sargon of Akkad on board, get your Count Dankula on board, get people who call themselves liberals and are not, and who disavow the alt-right and whatnot on board. They would love this shit. And because the fact is, even though we know SJWs are the enemy of the American people, to borrow the Trump phrase, and I don't, I say that tongue in cheek, but the fact is, liberals don't like this either. They disagree with us, but they share a common principle. And neocons want to win, so they have that in their favor to push this through. And and this is the kind of thing that I think is not so offensive to libertarians if you can dangle it that way. And a lot of these libertarians, I think, are starting to recognize the strategic imperative of this sort of thing. So I would actually be surprised if a skimmed down version of this wouldn't get the support of a Stefan Molyneux and a Lauren Southern. And once you have that, now you're on TV. Right now, you're on Sky News in the UK. You're on Australia's talk shows, and you get it in front of Tucker Carlson, and then boom, now Congress knows about it.
Absolutely, it's true that it's an issue that has been covered by pretty much every mainstream political personality. It's not tied to the right that much. It's more the fact that public personas have issues with. Everyone is scared of losing their contact to social media because our job depends on this. And there's certainly a lot of support to be gathered in this group. I think it would be possible. I don't know if I have the power to cause something like this, but maybe a concerted effort may awaken these personalities who often surf on the question of free speech, but here they would have an opportunity to actually join a fight that would change the state of free speech for people. So I would say in conclusion, just before I read the super chat, what Frame Games has proposed today is not a complete bill of rights, in my view. I think that we could talk in a future episode about how to formulate a true bill of rights that encompasses a lot of things. But what Frame Games is suggesting here is a kind of rat strategy of just chipping at what we can chip strategically, just doing what we can see as a doable thing within the next few years. And I think it makes sense to adopt that kind of strategy. Broadster says, 100th episode, congrats and keep them coming. Trump Calf says, after Frame Game leaves, can you elaborate on regression to the mean? How can you have positive eugenics or intelligence at all if IQ always regresses? The answer is natural selection. So yes, you can have positive eugenics. I'm not saying I support it, but yes, you can have a form of eugenics, or you can have a form of natural selection through pressure of the environment, which makes it such that yes, everyone is regressing to the mean when they're born, but not all of them end up making babies. And so in the next generation, you're not regressing to the mean anymore. You're regressing to the mean that was pushed by natural selection. That's how you can get an increase in IQ in a population. You need an environment that farms people with high IQ or low IQ for that matter, because you can select in any direction. But you're not bound to regress to the mean as long as there's a natural evolution process in play, a natural selection process. If you live in a world where everyone with anyone below 110 IQ ends up not being able to survive, then the next generation, you won't regress to the mean of 100. You'll regress to the mean of whatever people have survived by then. Anthony Cavallo, $10. Thank you so much for the donation. He says, is the name Frame Game a descriptor for his profession? I don't think it is, right? Frame Game? Frame Game refers to your conception of the frame game, of the game of word that the public space is subject to. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah, that's correct. Although I should note that I recently started a Heartright Risk League for folks who in our sphere of the political realm who want to play games like once a week on Sundays. So if you guys are interested, the games is now becoming literal. So
very nice. Interesting. Grogster says, just start your own Google, the Dave Rubin solution. Alexander sends $20. Thank you so much for the great donation. He says, keep up the good work. DP says, Jeff, don't get too discouraged, my friend. Never forget, all these problems are man-made and can be undone by men. Another great episode tonight, sir. Oh my God. I know that I'm the most black-pilled of all, and that even my audience is more positive than me. But when you read The Selfish Gene at whatever year, maybe I was 16 years old when I reread it. I don't remember. But when you read The Selfish Gene and you understand the crap that this world is and the constant forces that will keep showing up in society to violate your rights, and the fact that the state of liberty was just a sprinkle in the history of humanity, and that we will see those liberties being chipped at for the next hundreds of thousands of years, and when you see that we will eventually even get replaced by some cyborg that we've created ourselves that will fuck us in the ass, you don't have hope, and you don't think that that man can undo its own stupidity. All right, Frame Games, was there anything you wanted to add before we conclude?
What? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm stunned by that end. I mean, what?
I have no hope for humanity, Frame Game. Wasn't it clear?
I mean, first of all, you have a very nice haircut, and it's sort of a non sequitur, but like that level of blackpilling with that sharpness is very jarring to me.
That's being a Frenchman. You just captured the French spirit, nihilism and elegance.
All right, man. Well, that was elegant. All right. I guess we'll end this one on that note. That was. I hope someone clips that. By the way, that's worthy of the time capsule.
Let's make our next Frame Game reports where it's not you teaching us stuff. I will be teaching you how crappy that world is, and how ultimately any hope is totally useless, and the march of history forward will not be changed by IDs.
That would be a great internet blood sports / love sports. Is glass half full versus glass half empty, and the chat will determine like which way the glass is tilting.
Are you up for doing this next Monday?
I might need more than 1 week to prep for that, because I need to sort of gather all of the white pills in the world. It's sort of like the end of Dragon Ball Z, with like he's gathering the spirit bomb from every living, like loving life force in the universe. So, but let's talk about it offline. I definitely want to do it. I think that would be fun.
All right. I will turn all of your white pills into black pills. I will do the Frame Game on you. Have a great day, Frame Game. It was great talking to you.
You too. Bye.